The U.S. Supreme Court reached a historic decision yesterday upholding the third version of President Trump's travel ban by 5-4 margin. The ban primarily affects 5 mostly Muslim nations while also placing some limits on travel from North Korea and Venezuela.
The Supreme Court allowed this version of the ban to take effect in December while legal challenges moved forward. Justice Anthony Kennedy joined the court's 4 conservative judges to form the majority. Jen Crawford is outside the Supreme Court in Washington with more on this.
The president had lost at almost every turn in the lower courts, and in a statement after the decision, he vowed he would continue fighting for an immigration system that he said would serve the national interests of American citizens.
I will always be defending the sovereignty, the safety, and the security of the American people.
The administration framed the decision as a victory for security.
This decision is critical to ensuring the continued authority of President Trump.
As the Supreme Court emphasized, presidents have long had sweeping authority in defense of the nation. But Democrats were quick to call the ban discrimination that hurts the country.
It is dangerous. It makes us less safe.
Chief Justice John Roberts' opinion said this ban, the president's third try, did not target Muslims and covered 5 countries that past administrations had identified as security risks.
Refugees are welcome here.
The policy is a far cry from the president's first effort that caused chaos at airports worldwide.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
Dissenting justices said his campaign statement showed it was motivated by religious hostility. Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote, a reasonable observer would conclude it was motivated by anti-Muslim animus.
Americans know that we have freedom.
Rami Al-Mansoub is a U.S. citizen whose Yemeni wife and children are waiting for visas. Their future and that of other immigrant families is now in question.
We are all equal in this country, and we have rights, and it's protected. Well, guess what? It's not.
Now, the opinion said it was not endorsing the soundness of the policy, and Justice Anthony Kennedy, who was in the majority, wrote a separate concurring opinion, and without directly naming Donald Trump, said that government officials must remain committed to preserving our constitutional liberties that an anxious world is watching. Vlad and Anne-Marie.
Indeed. Jen Crawford, thank you. CBS News Chief White House correspondent Major Garrett joins us now from the White House, as he should be. Major, how is the Trump administration framing this victory? We got a bit of a tweet from the president maybe an hour after it came down. And also, what has been the Democrats' rebuttal to this?
Well, the administration wants and has tried to claim this as an absolute victory, setting aside and having a bit of amnesia about the fact that the first 2 versions of the travel ban it knew would not withstand constitutional scrutiny. That's why a third travel ban was propounded, a much different one than the first 2, one that did withstand Supreme Court scrutiny, though it had problems at the lower courts. And essentially what the Supreme Court, as Jan Crawford outlined, said and ruled was, as a procedural matter, this travel ban fits completely within the president's constitutional authority to deal with national security and immigration. And because it has a strong procedural foundation beneath it and speaks to communications between the United States government and other governments about the way those governments deal or don't adequately, in the opinion of the United States, deal with those who are coming to this country, then there's a legitimate authority the United States has to set up barriers to their legal entry. Supreme Court said within those narrow confines, this executive order is constitutionally defensible. But as also Jan indicated, the Supreme Court at least brought attention to individual claims and waivers that have to be granted under the executive order. And if those things don't happen, meaning if the executive order isn't followed to the letter, and there is a suggestion or hint or evidence of discrimination, then the administration will be vulnerable to legal challenges on that basis. So the court did uphold the travel ban and also alerted the administration to possible areas of vulnerability. Democrats essentially made the argument that the dissenters on the court did, that you have to look at the president's language, and that language itself carried with it the weight and emphasis that sounded discriminatory. And though this executive order didn't carry that language inside of it, it had to be viewed as a rational extension of that incendiary rhetoric. You can't separate the two, Democrats said. But the Supreme Court said, yes, you can, and the Supreme Court has. So as a matter of law, it stands.
Major, President Trump was asked yesterday if the ruling would embolden him to deport immigrants without due process. I want to play a bit of what he said.
We have to find a system where you don't need thousands of judges sitting at a border. Other countries look at us and they think we're crazy. They say, what kind of a thing is that? They have countries where they have no problem with people pouring in, and you have countries where people do want to go in. And if you look at the European Union, they're meeting right now to toughen up their immigration policies because they've been overrun. They've been overrun.
And Major, the reason I'm asking this question and the framing of the context of this question is because with the ruling yesterday in the president's favor, even though it is the third version of a very watered down proposal that was put forth earlier, the president obviously sees this as a victory, and it is. And for some, that reinforces his gut instincts that he's on the right path and the decisions that he makes are the right decisions because he's being awarded these wins as he sees them. So I'm curious if this win allows him to feel comfortable with the policy that he put forth in April.
Within the political context of the ongoing conversation about zero tolerance, family separations, it does give the administration what one official here described as vindication on general application of a tough border security policy. But that doesn't mean the president can, with a stroke of a pen, or Congress would even allow him to eliminate the judge's process on the border, which deals almost entirely with questions of asylum and refugee status. And the administration does make the point, and we've discussed it here before, that asylum claims have risen dramatically in recent years, and there is some evidence that either smugglers or those who are trying to enter the country illegally who don't have necessarily verifiable or justifiable asylum or refugee claims are using certain words in order to get into that judicial process. That's why the backlog now is more than 600,000 cases. And that's why there's this sense in Congress that you need to send more judges down there to get rid of that backlog. The administration wants Congress to tighten up the standards by which you can ask for and be granted judicial review if you make an asylum claim at a port of entry or somewhere else along the border. Absent that, what you have is zero tolerance, family separation, and all of the optics and all of the debate and emotion that carries and has carried that debate to the forefront of the American consciousness in the last 2 weeks. So it doesn't really fit that this administration needed something from the Supreme Court to make it more emboldened on the border. That process, zero tolerance, was set in motion in April of this year, long before this Supreme Court ruling. It was announced in a press release in May. This administration was going full steam ahead with it until the pictures, the video, the audio, and the emotional debate was joined in full force. And it has stepped back a little bit from that since. So I think you have to look at these things as aligned but distinctly separate. The travel ban was handled on a completely different track. It's a different issue. The question about border, asylum, refugee, and judges is something this administration is trying to work out with Congress. And if it doesn't work something out with Congress, it's going to have to struggle with the existing policy as it is.
So before we let you go, Major, this ruling would be sort of the most notable effect of the Republicans seating Neil Gorsuch on the Supreme Court. And you remember President Obama tried to seat his own judge, Merrick Garland, and the Republicans refused to even consider him at all. He tried to do it before the 2016 election. I'm wondering if this decision has perhaps reignited or opened some old wounds amongst Democrats there in Washington.
Sure, because the decision, 5-4, fits within, well, if Scalia were there, it would have been 5-4. Scalia was not there. Antonin Scalia died in February of 2016, and that set in motion the Merrick Garland nomination from President Obama. And as you accurately pointed out, Anne Marie, the Senate leadership under Mitch McConnell said, you know what? No nominee, no matter how qualified, is going to be given a hearing or a vote. No nominee, even long before President Obama announced Merrick Garland as the nominee. So it's not going to happen. We're going to put this question of the future of the Supreme Court before the voters. in a way that had never been delayed before. Never. And it was an enormous political risk, one that it turns out Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump won on their terms. The Supreme Court was decided, at least partly by the voters who said they wanted Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton, and he was allowed to fill that seat, a seat that remained vacant for a very long time without any real precedent of that duration in American history, because Republicans said we're not going to move the process forward. The mandate of the Senate to provide advice and consent to a duly nominated Supreme Court justice wasn't afforded, totally delayed, as a complete hardball political move. And the risky move was, if Trump wins, we get to fill that vacancy in the court. If he loses, Hillary Clinton does, and would probably be aggrieved and put a nominee up even more aggressive than Merrick Garland was. Turns out Republicans made that risky move, they got what they wanted, and they put Neil Gorsuch on the court. All of this will be a backdrop if Justice Anthony Kennedy retires at some time this year, and that vacancy presents itself before the midterm elections. Democrats will find themselves in a very similar position because Republicans have the majority votes to fill that seat, and if they rush to fill it in a midterm election year, they'll do that to not only fill the Kennedy seat, but to gin up support among their supporters, base supporters for Donald Trump, who have long been loyal to the president because of the future and composition of the Supreme Court. It played out that way in 2016, and if Justice Kennedy retires, it could well play out that way in 2018.
Yeah, for a lot of voters, that Supreme Court position was the only issue that they were really the most sort of moved by.
Mm-hmm.
So.
To be continued.
Well, I remember talking to lots of Trump supporters on the campaign trail who would get wobbly because of the way candidate Trump approached issues or his personality or his overall demeanor. They were not sure about that. But if there was one issue that kept a good percentage of those borderline wavering Trump supporters in the end with his candidacy, was the future of the Supreme Court. That was the essential hunch Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans had. They turned out to be right.
Yeah.
Indeed. Major Garrett, thank you as always.
Sure.